Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thrilled that you're all here tonight. Thank you for being here. My name is James Rondo. I have the great honor of serving as the director and Eloise W. Martin, president of our great museum, and I'm truly thrilled to welcome you tonight. And we're thrilled to be together tonight with extraordinary partners this evening to learn from David Getsy's award-winning scholarship on Scott Burton. As a brief and personal aside, as a museum employee, it's like the worst question in the world. Who's your favorite artist? It's like worse than asking, which of your 3 children is your favorite? And so, of course, I've forever dodged that bullet, and I won't say definitively, but truly, over the course of my education and my professional tenure as a museum employee, I have been such a profound admirer of Scott's practice, and David Getsy is a genius, and has profoundly expanded all of our understanding of Scott's importance. I understood his centrality in many, many ways, but didn't sufficiently understand why I admired Burton so profoundly, and David's scholarship has illuminated that. As does the current exhibition at Wrightwood. So suffice to say, you're in for a treat. Returning to more formal introductions, Dr. Getsy is the inaugural Eleanor Shea Professor of Art History at the University of Virginia, but of course is known to many of us in the room from his long tenure at SAIC, where he remains, thankfully, Professor Emeritus. David's book, Queer Behavior, Scott Burton and Performance Art, was published by the U of C Press and won the Robert Motherwell Book Award in 2023. David, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to Chicago and to congratulate you on your prestigious appointment as a 2025 Guggenheim Fellow. Today's program is proudly presented in partnership with Wrightwood 659 on the occasion, as I mentioned, of their exhibition Scott Burton Shape Shift, which includes several loans from our museum. We're grateful that they are included and thrilled to share an exhibition on view through December 20th at their extraordinary venue in Lincoln Park. We're grateful to Jen Kalish and the entire team at Wrightwood 659 and Alphawood Exhibitions for partnering with us once again. In 2022, we were privileged to collaborate to feature artist Rick Vanija, and in 2018, we welcomed the great architect Deo Ondo, who designed the Wrightwood 659 building, and here at our museum, a space simply known as the Ondo Gallery. So the partnership continues, and we're grateful for that, so thank you to Wrightwood. Now I'm pleased to welcome Jess Wilcox, curator of the Scott Burton exhibition, to make brief remarks about the project. But first, it's my great pleasure to bring to the podium Ashley Yonke, assistant curator at Wrightwood 659. Ashley, the podium is yours, and thank you everyone for being here.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ashley Yonke, the assistant curator at Wrightwood 659, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the program this evening with art historian David Getsy. This lecture is in conjunction with Scott Burton Shapeshift, an exhibition on view at Wrightwood 659 through December 20th, so I hope you all get over there soon. I want to thank Jess Wilcox for curating this extensive survey and her work on the comprehensive catalog, and to our partners at the Pulitzer Art Foundation who organized the exhibition. I hope to see most of you, or maybe not most of you, but many of you, tomorrow for an in-depth tour of the exhibition, co-led by David and Jess at 1 p.m. At Wrightwood 659, we're dedicated to presenting socially engaged art and architecture exhibitions. As a queer artist working during the AIDS crisis, Scott Burton embodies that mission. In 1989, he passed away at the age of 50 due to AIDS-related causes. but his work continues to endure as both an artistic expression in form and a political statement, reminding us that presence, touch, and visibility remain as powerful tools of care and resistance. Tonight, David will guide us through some of these ideas. Thank you, David, for your scholarship, which continues to deepen our understanding of Burton's legacy. And lastly, I want to thank James Rondeau and the outstanding team here at the Art Institute of Chicago for your generosity in sharing key works from your collection and your continued partnership on programs like tonight's lecture. Thank you also to Alphawood Foundation and the entire team who is around here at Wrightwood 659. None of this work would be possible without you, so thank you so much. I will now turn it over to Jess Wilcox, curator of Scott Burton Shapeshift. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you to the entire team at Wrightwood 659 and Alphawood Exhibitions. And again, thank you to the team at the Art Institute for lending works to this exhibition and for collaborating on this program tonight. Would be remiss if I didn't thank Fred Eichner for recognizing the importance of this show and bringing it to Chicago. I am also greatly indebted to Emily Pulitzer and the Pulitzer Art Foundation for supporting the original installation in St. Louis last year. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed speaker this evening, the main event. David J. Getsy's most recent book, Queer Behavior, Scott Burton and Performance Art, received the 2023 Robert Motherwell Book Award for the outstanding publication on the history and criticism of modernism in the arts. His other books include Abstract Bodies, 60s Sculpture in the Expanded Field of Gender, which was reissued in 2023, and Rodin, Sex and the Making of Modern Sculpture in 2010. He is the editor of Scott Burton's collected writings on art and performance, which was published in 2012, and the forthcoming Magic Episodes and Other Synchronicities, the trans-hemispheric correspondence of Scott Burton and Eduardo Costa, which will be published next year. As mentioned, he was awarded the 2025 Guggenheim Fellowship for his work on a new book titled Street Addresses, Performing the Queer Life of the Street in 1970s New York. Forthcoming is his article, Appearing Asymptomatic, Scott Burton's Public Art and the Knowledge of AIDS, in the November issue of the Smithsonian's Journal American Art. As mentioned, he's the professor emeritus at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and currently teaches at the University of Virginia, where he is Eleanor Shea Professor of Art History. Please help me in welcoming David J. Getsy.
Okay, so now I'd like to introduce, no, I'm just kidding. Before I start, I'd like to thank Joe Iverson, Francis Ward, Ashley Yankee, James Rondeau, Jess Wilcox, and Wrightwood 659 for their support of this exhibition and this collaborative lecture. So it's particularly meaningful that the exhibition Shapeshift has come to Chicago and to Wrightwood 659, and I'm grateful to be able to return here to the Art Institute to speak about Burton's work. Now, Burton's sculptures are often inconspicuous, but this allows them to weave their way into the patterns of everyday life. Many of us will have seen, and some of us have used, a Burton sculpture here in Chicago. Outside the education entrance, Burton's seating for 8 welcomes visitors and school children. Some may have sat on Burton's low-piece bench, which sometimes masquerades as gallery furniture at the Art Institute. Or you may have been confused to see a Queen Anne chair sitting in the modern wing before recognizing that it was cast in bronze. Similarly, his works are at the MCA in Chicago and can be seen in the courtyard of the Smart Museum at the University of Chicago. Inside the Smart, you may have also encountered Burton face to face. He is the central figure in Sylvia Slay's iconic feminist painting, Turkish Bath. And also, when the Modern Wing opened in 2009, the first rooftop exhibition was of Burton's functional sculptures. Well, as was mentioned, I was a faculty member at SAIC for over 15 years, and I was fortunate to teach with the Art Institute collection on a weekly basis. My students from SAIC will have all heard me talk about Burton, and I regularly took them out to seating for 8 to sit on the sculpture and to discuss it. It was also a staple of my lectures that I would boldly declare that the bronze chair is one of the most important sculptures of the 20th century. I have not wavered in that. That's a different lecture. I discuss bronze chair and other works in this book that has been mentioned that's on Burton's work in the 1970s that focuses on his performance art, but also his early sculptures. And this, again, was published by University of Chicago here. Now, that book stops its narrative in 1980. And that's the last year Burton made performance art. But I haven't quite been able to quit him. And I have continued to write about his work of the 1980s. And what I'm going to do today is give you a talk about the concluding years of Burton's practice before he died of AIDS-related illness in 1989. This talk's going to be largely drawn from the essay that I contributed to the Wrightwood catalog, but it also incorporates this forthcoming article on Burton's relationship to the AIDS crisis, which will be out next month. Now, since I have you here, I also want to just give another plug for this forthcoming book, which Ugly Duckling Press will publish in 2026, which is an annotated edition of the decade-long correspondence between Burton and his close friend, the Argentinian conceptual artist Eduardo Costa, which I'm co-editing with Patrick Greeny from the University of Colorado. But onto the matter at hand. So today, my focus again is going to be on the last years of Burton's practice from roughly 1986 to 1989. Some of the works I discuss are in the Wrightwood exhibition, which again is the first major exhibition of Burton's work in the US for nearly 40 years, and the first to offer a full view of his practice as a performance artist, a public artist, and a sculptor. In what follows, I'm going to give you a very rapid overview of Burton's main priorities. It is going to be on the quicker side before focusing on these concluding years, because it was in these last works that Burton offered reflections on some of the queer priorities that underwrote his practice of making sculpture throughout his career. But again, these first general comments will introduce some of Burton's work to those who are new for it. So, by design, Burton's sculptures are easily overlooked. They humbly but assertively occupy places where people move, meet, and wait. They are functional sculptures of chairs, benches, and other furniture, but they are also obdurate, heavy, and choreographic objects that harbor, direct, and hold their own in public spaces. One uses a Burton sculpture best when one turns one's back on it in order to accept its offer of support. But these sculptures are not merely pieces of furniture. They ask to be seen both for their utility and the reimagining of the categories of chair, bench, or table. Burton's sculptures, in other words, perform as furniture. These sculptural performers play their roles by proposing physical engagements to those who approach. They bear the weight and make places for bodies and touch. In some of his most important late works, Burton began to elucidate the stakes of these proposals, and he began to introduce subtle and eventually explicit, allusions to the human figure in his work. Now, as I'm going to discuss, these quasi-figurative sculptures in the final years were both reflective and instructive. They disclosed the keys to the codes that had long animated Burton's vision for sculpture and public art as being open, embracing, and available to all. Well, first, let's start with the 1970s, when Burton focused on performance art made from the bodies of others, combined with pieces of furniture cast as characters. Guided by his extensive reading in behavioral psychology and communication studies, Burton examined nonverbal languages of pose, gesture, and proximity in order to develop a precise vocabulary for analyzing how bodies conversed and congressed. He was influenced by the eruption of feminist art and criticism, and he sought to ally himself with this position and interrogate how persons were categorized within hierarchies of class, sexuality, and behavior. Most importantly, his research and art were shaped by his own queer experiences of body language, both as a defensive camouflage and as signaling of desire for connection. In particular, Burton drew from and made performances about street cruising, the finding of outlaw desire and mutual connection in public. He committed to making art that was rooted in such queer experiences. He developed these performance works, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to really go into the details of these like nearly hour-long performances, but then we'd be here all night. He developed these works that thematized the day-to-day encounter with homophobia, with self-monitoring, with gendered expectations for behavior, and the resistant ways that queer people learn to hide in plain sight to evade danger, and the coded signals they use to find each other despite it all. However, Burton was not content to make work about identity. Instead, he drew from his queer experiences, his specific experiences, larger lessons about power dynamics, the imposition of norms, and the critique of hierarchies. And these were the foundations from which he developed ideas about art's potential to be open to all. Now, alongside these performance works that I'm very briefly mentioning, he began making sculptures of furniture. And they also operated in this mode of camouflage and code. He saw in the humble chair, bench, or table a pathway towards an art that left behind its elitism. His works aimed to be demotic, as he called it, that is, speaking in an ordinary, common language, as a means of democratizing the object. And here you see the Art Institute's bronze chair exhibited for the first time, not in the gallery at Artist Space, where he had his first one-person show, but across the street from it, so that it masqueraded as a piece of street furniture that also may be picked up and taken to someone's home. It is a very heavy object because it's cast in bronze, so no one was able to take it. But just to give you an idea that these sculptures and this idea of furniture as being something that welcomed, that you knew exactly what to do with when you encountered it, was also something that was always linked to performance in Burton's ideas. Now, in later years, he would develop this in his public art especially, saying, quote, "One of the impulses motivating me is the desire to make some works that people can understand immediately. His sculptures and what to do with them are quickly and easily grasped." And this is exactly part of this idea of being open and available to everyone and thinking about a kind of anti-elitist practice that he drew from his own experiences of finding public space a field of both danger and pleasure. Now, these sculptures are there and made to be relied upon, even if those who do so ignore or are ignorant of their status of art. And this is an option that Burton fully embraced as equally valid as that of the supposedly knowledgeable art viewer. These sculptures offer anonymous and unconditional service, and they were indebted to these lessons that he was drawing from sexual cultures and how power dynamics might be thought of differently in public space. After 1980, Burton realized that these ideas about the demotic and democratizing sculpture were best pursued in public art, and he committed himself to that aim. He recognized that in order to be a public artist, however, his art's basis in cruising and queer experience could not be foregrounded, as it was in much of the 70s work, even if it was still present as a theme. Municipalities, commissioning boards, community forums, and institutional structures for public art are often allergic to even the slightest hint of sexuality or of queer life. Such a prejudice was heightened during the decade in which Burton operated as a public artist, that is the 1980s with the conservative Reagan Revolution, the political weaponizing of family values, the culture wars, and the demonization of homosexuality and sex in general that was perpetrated during the first years of the AIDS crisis. Any artist aspiring to do public work during that decade had to navigate a climate of prejudice, homophobia, and censorship. Now, Burton, as I mentioned briefly, had long investigated the critical possibilities of dissemblance, that is, the knowing performance of one manner to mask or distract from a disparate intention, of being critically duplicitous. It was, after all, this was the core tactic of cruising, and it was necessary for queer survival. But Burton extends this by thinking about how his sculptures and his public art and his statements about them might be itself a larger practice in which there are multiple layers of meaning. One that simply looks normal, and the other that is coded with all of these themes about anonymous use and repeated openness. So he made works that switched codes to speak to multiple audiences. As with cruising, this all has to hide in plain sight. Now, over the years, when I've discussed how Burton left more explicit performance art behind and shifted the presentation of his artistic persona and his sculpture around 1981, I've heard a common reply that Burton was somehow closeting himself again, thereby betraying his decade-long engagement with gay liberation and queer sexual cultures. This is an error. Burton was no less overt or out in his personal life or his relationships, but rather he chose to double down on the strategy of dissemblance in order to be a democratic artist, in order to make work that could serve the public and work its way into those institutions, public art forums, and museums that might be allergic to that, to the more explicit work. Now, with this practice, he left objects that explored the very potential of going unnoticed, of being used, of willing submissiveness, and of these objects' generous continued offers of support, which are a promiscuous openness to constant new interactions and contact. Now, this practice of going stealth in order to become a public artist and to infiltrate these public art commissions was quite successful, and I've been showing you some of his major public works. But in the mid-1980s, Burton began to realize that he needed to offer some clues to the ciphers that had long underwritten his practice. And in some of these later works, he did this by suggesting human figures and their relations. He knew well that furniture was anthropomorphic, with its legs and feet and backs and seats, and that furniture took its shape in order to hold and support the human body. By invoking the figure in some of these works, Burton reminded us that his sculptures had always been performing bodies that invited the viewer to become a sitter. After all, his anonymous-looking sculptures propose a temporary intercourse in which his sitters' bodies are cradled from behind and underneath. Now, I trace this beginning, this figurative reveal, to 1986, which was the year of his first major retrospective at the Baltimore Museum of Art. He worked closely with the curator Brenda Richardson to craft a narrative about his sculpture through the exhibition and the catalog, leaving out all of the work in performance and the conceptual art. Now, Richardson recalled that Burton insisted on this edit. And she said, quote, he wanted the retrospective to focus on the artworks as sculptures and as civic amenities, period, unquote. Now, Burton was being strategic by narrowing this view of his earlier work to simply the sculpture. And this presentation bolstered the image of him as a public artist, just at a crucial time when he was beginning to realize and gain new major commissions. But however, I would argue that Burton's reflection on his career at this moment of the retrospective also initiated a question for him about how his work's conceptual and indeed emotional complexity might have been buried too deeply and consequently in danger of being lost. And again, it's important to remember that Burton lived with AIDS from around 1983, 84 through to 1989. And so questions of legacy in the future were never far behind. Now, as a means of hinting at the queer themes that have been so important to his thinking, Burton introduced a sculpture at the last minute to the exhibition, Two-Part Chair, which was one of the most recent works that he had made. The Baltimore catalog didn't even have time to illustrate the sculpture. It was still being designed and fabricated as the book was going to print. It, again, was a late addition that Burton made sure to posit as an endpoint of the exhibition's narrative. He had earlier designed the works called Two-Part Chair in 1983 and 1984, but here he updated the bipartite formula in such a way that the physical dynamic between the two blocks became much more figurative and suggestive. So, like all of Burton's works, Two-Part Chair is made to be sat on. It performs as a functional chair while also appearing at first to be an abstract geometric sculpture. That abstraction, however, comes into focus as subtly figurative when we circle to the profile of the sculpture. From there, the formal dynamics intimate a penetrative sexual act in which two schematically rendered figures face in the same direction, one bent over in front of the other. And so you can see where that happens, just to make sure. Now, in this work, he enhanced the ways that the two components could be read as figures, interlocked and supporting each other. The art critic Nancy Princenthal wrote, quote, the relationship between components in Two-Part Chair is easily enough read as two figures engaged in anal intercourse and witty enough if seen in that way. And then she added, quote, Burton acknowledged this reading reluctantly, unquote. Now, again, so now this reference is indirect enough to be plausibly deniable. We may not see it. And not all viewers might have recognized this allusion to two figures. However, Two-Part Chair's presence as one of the newest sculptures in the exhibition no doubt prompted more than a few viewers to look again at the earlier work, questioning how it too might carry some queer potential. Well, more than an allusion to sex, however, what I find most poetic about the relationship between this sculpture's abstracted bodies is the way that these two equally massed components are mutually supportive. Alone, neither of the elements would be structurally sound as a chair, but together they are sturdy and load-bearing. In Burton's earlier chairs made from two parts, at least one of the components could stand on its own. The partners within Two-Part Chair, however, both rely on each other, locked in a reciprocal grip. If separated, the two parts would lose stability, collapse, be unrecognizable as figures, and become useless as furniture. Together, however, these two near-identical elements keep each other vital in their endless moment of accord. Now, the sexual allusion in Two-Part Chair is secondary to this broadest theme of selfless support, in which the bottom becomes the base on which both the top and the sitter rely when sitting on this. Now, that's at the Pulitzer exhibition. Now, I see this, the way that this work functions as an allegory for Burton's sculptural practice of making self-effacing sculptural objects that perform as furniture in order to offer themselves for use. And so the dynamics that are allegorized by the sculpture are ones that can be extended outward, even into the non-figurative sculptures, which emphasize the willing submissiveness and selfless support that all Burton sculptures hope to offer. Now, Burton's very close friend, Eduardo Costa, has on multiple occasions reinforced to me the importance of this work for Burton. Costa called it, quote, perhaps the educated queer artwork par excellence, unquote. And Costa also relayed to me that Burton understood that, quote, doing it in geometric forms allowed it to be public, unquote. And that Burton only felt he could operate in the realm of public art through such strategies of code switching and camouflage. Now, this creation and last-minute inclusion of two-part chair came at a crucial moment in Burton's life and not just career. 1986 was crucial for him not just because of the retrospective exhibition. Now, while this reading must remain a little bit speculative, there are other developments that may help to explain why Burton would choose to initiate such a decryption at this time. After the Baltimore exhibition had opened, Burton chose to schedule experimental surgery to manage the encroaching effects of HIV/AIDS. Again, he had been living with its symptoms for a few years, but it became pronounced enough for him to take a desperate step of having a splenectomy, which was explored as an early treatment to address low T-cell counts. At this time of career success and retrospection, Burton was also confronted with his own mortality. While the full extent to which such events impacted his artistic decision-making must remain unknowable, I nevertheless cannot help but question how the daily experience of living with AIDS and its uncertainties came to affect Burton's thinking about the future of his work and its reception. Both the Baltimore exhibition and the splenectomy made 1986 a pivotal year for Burton, one in which retrospection and projection were intertwined. His subsequent late work, as I'm calling it, involved a redoubling of his efforts to create public art, but in addition, his independent, non-site-specific sculptures, his independent sculptures, began more and more to intimate the human figure and bodily contact. In the autumn of 1987, Burton held a one-person exhibition at Max Protech Gallery in what would be his first major New York showing after the retrospective. For it, he put on a display the figurative illusions that he had introduced in 1986 with two-part chair, which was also included in the gallery exhibition in 1987. Prompted by two-part chair, the New York Times critic Michael Brenson foregrounded the sexual implications of Burton's art as his overriding concern in his review of the show. In addition to two-part chair, Brenson's review singled out a new work that Burton had created for the exhibition, this 1987 two-part chaise longue. Brenson wrote, quote, "There is a dimension of Mr. Burton's work that is almost pornographic. It is there in the suggestion of friction between the two rectangular blocks of two chairs. It is there in the chaise longue, which resembles a reclining figure that we are invited to lie on top of. It is most evident in objects with more than one part." Now here, Brenson did more than point to the erotic capacities of Burton's sculpture. He likened the work to pornography and made the exposure of sexuality his central focus in his review. When I discussed this review with Michael Brenson, who has been nothing but principled in his understanding of what his role as a critic and also in sharing his material with me, and so I thank Michael for being so open with this material. Indeed, Brenson shared with me a series of letters that he and Burton sent to each other in the months before and after this review. So Brenson had initially written an article about public sculpture and Art Park in upstate New York, which included a brief but positive comment on Burton's work. Burton then wrote to Brenson to initiate a dialogue about public art and explain some of the ideas behind his own work, which Burton boldly, he could be quite hyperbolic at times, Burton boldly claimed was, quote, an affront to the ideals of heroism and higher subjectivity, unquote, because of its plainness and inconspicuousness. And Burton encouraged Brenson to see the Max Protet Gallery exhibition. But in that Times review, that happened just a few weeks later, Brenson transposed the ideas from Burton's letter into the content of the review. So the review continues, quote, the split within Burton's work between a social and sexual, public and private self may shed light on Mr. Burton's resistance to heroic art. Ideas of heroism and wholeness usually go together. Is there a relationship between the sexuality and Mr. Burton's populism? Is the tension in the work truly subversive, or does the combination of raw sexuality, which in American art has become synonymous with radicality, and decorum, produce just another form of camp? Okay. Now, Brenson's comments here are symptomatic of the double bind of queer visibility in the 1980s, in which the representation of homosexuality, or an allusion to everyday queer sexual practices, was seen as scandalous, confrontational, and dangerous. Such anxieties, of course, are not limited to the 1980s, but they were particularly pronounced in the years of Brenson's review, years when the homophobic stereotypes circulated freely in mainstream media, gay sex became equated with AIDS, and the culture wars were fomenting. And there were increasing calls in these years, we have to remember, to ban any representation of AIDS or queer life because it, quote unquote, promoted homosexuality. This is what's going on in these years, right? Elsewhere in the review, Brenson compared Burton's abstracted sexual dynamics in his work, which again are pretty tame, I would say. But he compared these to the straight artist David Salle with their dramatic sexual, David Salle's paintings with dramatic sexual focuses on women's bodies. But Burton's elusive sculptures and chairs and chaises hardly seem to qualify with what Brenson called them, quote, rubbing images from pornography magazines against images of high art, unquote. This is what Brenson charged in his review. So again, in the homophobic climate of the decade, any representation of queer sexuality was inescapably fraught and political, but Burton was aiming for neither confrontation nor titillation. Instead, he had been consistent in trying to search for an anti-elitist definition of art that anyone could understand, but also one that was shaped by a resistant infiltration of queer themes in public spaces and discourses, that is, in hiding in plain sight and being more than one thing. Brenson's critique, wittingly or unwittingly, hinged on the fact that the mere identification of queer sexuality in an artwork was scandalous and consequently blameworthy for it. Well, some weeks after the review was published, Burton could not hold back any longer and sent an angry postcard to Brenson. Shame. So, I love it. Brenson replied in a letter to Burton and wrote that the content of his review, quote, was a response to a question about the effectiveness and meaning of work that says one thing to the general public and an entirely different thing to people in the know, unquote. So Brenson detected the code the code switching in Burton's works, but saw it, as many tend to see dissemblance or defensive camouflage, as disingenuous. Brenson felt it was his role to call it out and expose it. Burton likely feared that this denuding, in a highly public and powerful venue like the New York Times art section, and this comparison of his work to pornography would lead to viewers to seeing his work as only about raw sexuality and homosexuality. Now, like many artists who worked from marginalized identities, Burton rejected a narrow classification of his art as solely representing that identity. He regularly refused the idea that his work was merely gay art. While his artistic practice was undoubtedly rooted in his queer experiences and his extrapolation from them, again, he was determined to build from its lessons more democratic and anti-elitist priorities. The figurative illusions that emerge are merely the deeper codes that help us understand how these works are coming from that personal experience, but they are not the overriding meaning of these works. And so Burton saw Brenson's critique of the work as coded pornography or as camp, as threatening to overtake and caricature his artistic aims. Now, a longer view of Burton's practice and of the pressures on queer representation in the decade allow us to ask whether whether the frustration with dissemblance that Brenson expressed in his review was the result of a lack of recognition and experience with code switching as a necessary survival tactic, or its use as a source of pleasure, or a challenge to those who sought to censor any representation of queer life or desire. So Brenson astutely saw the cipher of Burton's sculpture, but he put his sole faith in the exposure of it. Brenson later explained in a letter to Burton, quote, "I started to pick up the same thing in other works. I went home. I looked through the catalogs, read through several texts, including Brenda Richardson's. I saw the signs of sexual imagery in past works and saw no one raising it as a possible issue. I went back to the show, had the same impressions, only stronger. I decided to write something that would provoke people either to confirm this issue or attack me," unquote. So Brenson desired explicitness about the issue and saw Burton's dissemblance as contradictory, rather than, as I would argue, an animating question for queer survival in public and a sustained artistic and conceptual strategy that had characterized Burton's work for 2 decades. But the real contention for Burton was Brenson's use of the term camp as a concluding criticism. Now, camp is a revaluation of the devalued, in which cultural norms are inverted, with the low, such as kitsch, sentimentality, or excess, becoming recast as the high, the ideal, the exemplary, and the good. Ever since Susan Sontag's 1964 essay, Notes on Camp, became one of the most widely read essays of the 1960s in the United States, camp had also been seen as synonymous with homosexuality. Combined with Brenson's description of Burton's work as almost pornographic, Brenson's accusation that the work was another form of camp could not be read other than as a dismissal of it as being solely about homosexuality and ironic frivolity. Brenson could not have fully known how much the mention of camp would have struck Burton. Critics of Burton's work had, since the 1970s, often taken pleasure in attempting to out Burton's works by gleefully hinting at his work's perversity, excess, and camp. Camp had been used by other critics to chide or to attack Burton's work, such as by the critic Robert Pincus Witten, and also in a highly critical review by the conservative writer Hilton Kramer, who caustically declared in 1981, quote, that what Scott Burton's chairs and tables amount to, I think, is a variety of camp attempting to go straight and having a difficult time of it, unquote. Now, camp, as deployed by Kramer, was a way of relegating Burton's work to negative stereotypes of homosexuality as unserious, duplicitous, and inconsequential. Now, so while Burton no doubt found Brenson's comparison of his work to pornography to be reductive and misguided, the designation as camp was doubly infuriating because of this longer history. When Burton objected to this term strongly, Brenson indeed responded in a subsequent letter to him saying, quote, "If I had known that camp was as loaded as you indicate, I would not have used it," unquote. So Burton was enraged by Brenson's review, there is no doubt. But I do believe that its criticisms and rhetoric influenced Burton's thinking about just what and how much to reveal in his work, which accelerate some of these things. Now, this is evident in how Burton talked about his work in 1988 and 89, and also the new projects he developed. At this time, he began to mention that the work was more directly about the human figure, as in a 1988 lecture in Amsterdam, when he sometimes thought that the 2-part chaise longue was, quote, like a figure lying on a beach, taking in the sun, For me, they have such strong elements of the human figure, and that is very new and very challenging, unquote. Burton extended this more directly symbolic approach in a couple of key works in 1988 and 89, in which he began to look back to his history and reference his earlier work and performance. So first, in these final years of his life, 1988 and 89, Burton's career experienced two phenomena. First, a rapid acceleration of his status in the art world. He saw multi-year public art projects coming to completion. He was planning new proposals. He was working on an upcoming European retrospective of his sculpture. And the Museum of Modern Art asked him to curate the first of its artist choice exhibitions in which an artist selected works from the collection. The years 1980 and 89 were also a period of evolution and self-reflection for Burton. And he began to return to the works that he had previously left out of his narrative from the 1970s, works that he spent a decade developing in the 70s. And I think Burton chose to defiantly reclaim Brenson's accusation that his work was camp, indeed with a major project that has been come to be known as the last tableau, which is a kind of campy scene from a B-movie. And I will talk about this in a little bit more detail at the end of the talk. But according to Burton's close friend, Sia Armajani, Burton's ideas for this work stretch back to the years 1979, when Burton was in the midst of revising his individual behavior tableau performances for a new version at the Berkeley Art Museum. Now, especially in this final form, in what would be his last work of performance art, individual behavior tableau thematized bodily signaling, power dynamics, gendered nonverbal communications of street cruising and bathhouse encounters. And it was this performance in particular that Burton began to bring back in some of these sculptures, especially in this last tableau project. He had maquettes and sketches prepared, working out every detail of material, composition, and execution. Indeed, it was one of Burton's most elaborate plans for his sculpture, for independent sculpture, but he kept the plans and models for it largely private. So again, I'm going to return to this work, which is really complex, in a moment, but it's first important to talk about one of Burton's other last sculptures that also harks back to individual behavior tableau, and that, again, provides some clues to what's going on in his work. In late 1987, Burton received a commission for a memorial work to be permanently sited at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. Burton delayed work on this commission until 1989 and approved final designs for it just weeks before his death in December of 1989. He was really precise in his plans for a memorial bench. He wanted a white marble base with a green granite wedge to function as the bench's back. His notes, his correspondence, and his construction diagrams make this material pas de deux central to his conception. Now, marble is often used in memorial or funereal contexts, but granite was the stone that Burton most often used for his public and independent sculptures of the 1980s, and indeed because of its permanence, resilience, hardness, and ability to endure multiple uses. Now, these two material choices allegorize the sculpture's commemorative function. That is, this work looks back to the past as a memorial, but it is, like all of Burton's works, a functional sculpture that endures into the future to offer itself as a site of respite. In a letter to one of MoCA LA's curators, Burton's studio manager, Nina Felschen, conveyed information Burton had shared before he died with his art assistant, Thomas Abate Marco, about Memorial Bench and its materials. Quote, "The lower part, white marble, is meant to be like a bench or piece of furniture, a bier. It is the monument part of the piece. The upper part, green granite, is meant to suggest life, a body in repose. The color green was chosen as a symbol of life. Apparently, Scott thought of it as a monument for two people. This might be a little weird to tell Marcia, since she's still very much alive, but the reason the granite upper part is set back to allow room on the bench for another body in repose. When Scott was very sick, he said to Tom, "This is going to be my monument." For this commemorative sculpture, Burton made a work about mourning the dead while also acknowledging the mourner as an enduring witness. It is also subtly figurative. That green granite body in repose is the undying companion to the loss that it contemplates, but it also waits for those who might come to sit on the bench. This is indeed a personal work about living with and through death, but the theme is not statically represented, but rather enacted through memorial benches' expectancy of new sitters and new engagements. Like Burton's other works, it remains a functional sculpture of furniture, ready to bear the weight of those who approach it. Sitting in the courtyard of Mocha, LA, this monument dissembles as a place to rest, to pause, or to wait. The bench's offer of support and contact, like the evergreen symbolic mourner that forms its back, is endless, repeatable, and open to all. This work can be understood to thematize the knowledge of AIDS that shaped Burton's sculptural practice throughout the 1980s. So in this talk, I've not really talked a lot about this feature, but it is important to remember that this shadowed Burton's career, and this experience informs his stalwart commitment to making public sculptures that offered moments of care, that are allowed to be touched, and relied upon, and that endure as places for moments of social contact. Burton's works aspire to endure and wait successively for the next person to come along. The abstracted figure in green granite on Memorial Bench symbolizes the unending devotion of one who both reflects on impermanence and waits for the next moment of contact. And this is a characterization I would extend to all of Burton's usable public sculptures. I cannot help but see the vigilant expectancy of this work as a response to the political and personal conditions of the AIDS crisis, in which mortality, contact, touch, and the future were in constant question. Burton made enduring, obdurate sculptures that, despite it all, offer a brief moment of care again and again. This work is self-consciously a memorial, first for the patron, and by implication for Burton himself. But it is also a work that looks to the future for its new moments of contact and support and loss, and contact and support and loss. It's significant that Burton chose to allude to his more overtly queer performance work from a decade earlier in the form of this bench, and what he knew was going to be one of his last works. Its commemoration extends as well to that earlier moment in Burton's work when he made the bodily and sexual themes of his work central to his artistic practice. And Burton reminds us of that. Now, this work is one of a few works in which Burton is looking back to pivotal moments in his career. Importantly, he also returned to two-part chair, making a wider version in sunset red granite that year. Two-part chair enlarged version extends the single-person seating of its forebearer to make just enough room for a couple to sit closely together on it. All of these reflective works were not really exhibited or completed at the time of Burton's death in 1989, and many were fabricated by his assistant posthumously. And this is the case with the last tableau, which his design and work for it went on during these years, but was only fabricated in 1981 for the only time it's been exhibited in the lobby of the Whitney Museum of American Art as a memorial exhibition to Burton. So the last tableau is how I will conclude this talk. And it was the most ambitious of Burton's sculptures that looked back to the 1970s. And it's unique amongst Burton's body of work for its now overt figuration and explicitly anthropomorphizing titles. The ensemble leans into camp references by presenting this B-movie scene with a bench goddess flanked by two tall armoires as guards and the provocative slave table prostrating itself. The last tableau departs from the canny indirectness of Burton's previous sculpture. It was not just clearly figurative, but also, more importantly, it made willing submissiveness its overt theme. Now, submissiveness, after all, is what Burton's sculptures perform, as they offer themselves to users. In writing about the last tableau, the artist Richard Kalina observed that, quote, domination, protectiveness, and submission were scarcely idle abstractions for Burton, unquote. And this is a theme that many people began to talk about, including with me in the interviews I've done over the years with Scott Burton's work and friends. So Eduardo Costa told me directly during an interview how much the last tableau meant to him. Speaking of the aggressive male armoires, the settee as an imperious goddess, and the slave table, he said, quote, all three, psychologically speaking, are part of Scott, unquote. But then he added, with all admiration for Burton's defiant spirit, quote, he identified most strongly with the slave table, unquote. More recently, Costa reiterated this, saying, quote, the table is serving the goddess. It's his masochistic side, unquote. Now, of course, this term slave is undoubtedly problematic with a complex and painful history, but it also was and is used as a term in BDSM communities to refer to a submissive role in a consensual relation. Now, Burton had long been a participant in the leather and BDSM communities, and this is something he also thematized in his work of the 70s. And he'd been making works since then that also drew on his experience of those sexual cultures. With this sculpture, Burton allegorized the complex experience of the willing submissive in BDSM, but he refracted the role of the sex slave through the camp movie scenario of the domineering goddess queen. Costa riffed on this in our conversations, comparing Burton to a Hollywood movie that had been grist for camp. Quote, Scott, in his most extreme incarnation, was a super slave, a sort of Spartacus that couldn't wait to turn the table on his master, unquote. Other critics who knew Burton well also remarked on how submissiveness was a charged and consistent theme throughout Burton's work, as when Robert Pincus Witten told me in an interview that, quote, masochism was the real clue to Burton's art, unquote. And, quote, the conditions of the forms and the presentations were deeply marked by his masochism, unquote. Acknowledging this source, embracing it even, Burton's friend, the art historian Robert Rosenblum, would later hyperbolically call the last tableau, quote, a sadomasochistic furniture fantasy, unquote. Now, whereas Brenson had accused Burton of employing camp to hide or undercut the seriousness of his anti-elitist ideals, in this work, Burton made a reply, reclaiming camp and humor as means to figure the concerns that he had been working with for decades. Writing in the pamphlet to the 1991 exhibition of this work, Robert Rosenblum concluded that the last tableau opened new ways of seeing Burton's sculpture, even, quote, for those of us who thought they already knew his art, unquote. With the last tableau, Burton revealed how much his practice of functional sculpture was rooted in the knowledge of bodies, the ethics of sexual cultures, and of willing submissiveness and open offers of embrace. The slave table was the most figurative sculpture Burton would ever create, and the ensemble made it a focal point. Its figurative explicitness challenges the viewer to acknowledge the power dynamics and ethics of using this table. This sculptural performer has prostrated itself not just before the goddess bench, but before us, asking us to acknowledge and respect the generosity, care, strength, and resilience it takes to be the willing submissive. All of Burton's functional sculptures make values of service and receptivity, and they achieve their open address to viewers, to users, and passersby by being offered for use, overlooked as art, and ready to bear the bodies of others. These late works, from Two-Part Chair to Last Tableau, figure the deeper dynamics that had fueled Burton's work all along. As Burton's studio assistant, Thomas Abate-Marco, recalled to me about the last tableau, quote, "It was a requiem. It was an opportunity to let go, to have the final hurrah," unquote. And with that work, Burton demanded that we look back at all that we had previously overlooked in his sculpture. Thank you very much.